Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, it is my joy and delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And this morning, we are very honored to have with us Candida Moss, who is the Cadbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham in England. She is the author of the very recent book, God's Ghostwriters, Enslaved Christians in the Making of the Bible. It is available in our bookstore after the forum if you'd like to pick up a copy, as well as another recent book of hers entitled Divine Bodies, Resurrecting Perfection in the New Testament and Early Christianity. Professor Moss, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with the why. Why this book, and what was it like putting it together?
That's a great question. So, right before the pandemic started, I found myself starting to have difficulties reading. And so I did what everyone does, and I got reading glasses. For the first time. You know, I was getting like bigger monitors to avoid this problem. But eventually I got reading glasses, and I thought to myself, what did people do in antiquity when they couldn't read without glasses? And so I looked into it because I'm interested in disability, and I realized, well, they used other people to read and write. They didn't have glasses. And the people that they used were primarily enslaved people. And that was so obvious. Of course they did. Of course that's what they did. But it led me down, I was supposed to be writing a totally different book, but it led me down this path of, I want to see who these people were. I want to know what they did. I want to know how people read and wrote and interpreted texts. And the more I dug into it, the more I looked at manuscripts and looked at the history of reading and writing, the more I realized that the early Christian movement, the texts that I had been writing about for 2 decades, were put together with the assistance of this group of invisible workers. And when I say invisible, they're not totally invisible. They're right there. You know, Romans, arguably Paul's most important letter. Romans 16:22, we get this greeting from this man called Tertius, and Tertius is a very common name for enslaved people. And Tertius says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you. So Paul is pretty transparent, you know? Paul tells us, makes Tertius visible to us. We're the problem. We're the ones who don't see those people. So they're invisible, but they're also not that invisible. And so obviously at that point, I had to sort of abandon the book I was supposed to be writing to try and find out as much as I could and try and tell this story. So that is why I wrote it. And to the question of how, it was hard because I had to I looked at thousands of inscriptions and manuscripts to tell the stories of people that we have sort of deliberately not remembered is difficult. And so I had to look to other fields where people have tried to do that. I read a lot of archaeological reports about how prevalent vision loss, like mine, age-related vision loss, would have been, how arthritis would have made it impossible for people to use book rolls, which is what people were using in the 1st century CE. And I had to do a lot of reading in the history of labor and sort of learning how clerical workers, and ironically, I've been a clerical worker. I did data processing entry for Citibank. How they always make contributions to the text. And so it was difficult, but it was also probably the work that I've written a lot of books. I've been very fortunate in my career, and this is the book I'm the most passionate about, and certainly the one that I worked hardest on. I think I was telling you before we started, I used to just sit down and write, feeling quite clever and proud of myself. But this book, I had to rewrite it a number of times. I had to have lots of people read things and check them for me because it felt so important. And after sort of 2,000 years of not talking about these people, I didn't want to be the one who made sloppy mistakes that caused other people to say, well, we don't have to think about them anymore anyway. So it was hard.
You mentioned this kind of hiding in plain sight quality, and I was struck by the Romans example. This is kind of one of the so-called undisputed letters of Paul that we were taught in seminary. We know he wrote this one,
Right.
and yet it says there right in the text, I, Tertius, who have written this.
Yeah.
It's a very kind of striking example of how we miss the clues that are right there for us to see.
Yeah, and that's right. It's not disputed. And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying Paul didn't write this letter. Paul wrote the letter. He dictated it. I'm saying it's a collaboration between them. And that when you look at how people took dictation, which is what we assume Tertius did, it's a creative process. It's not like I learned shorthand when I was a kid, because I don't think my mother thought I was going to make it as an academic. And she was like, let's make sure she can be an administrative assistant when this doesn't pan out. So, but that was very standardized. If I took shorthand and someone else could read shorthand, they could read what I did, but that's not the case in antiquity. Whatever Tertius wrote down, probably no one else could read but Tertius or another enslaved worker trained just like him. But certainly Paul couldn't. And when you think about Paul writing letters while he was imprisoned underground, where there's no light, he probably couldn't have even reviewed the letters. I'm not saying that Paul isn't involved. Paul is involved, but there are other people involved too. And anyone who's ever had a job where you do work that really helps someone who's, more important than you, and you never get credit for that work, you should empathize with Tertius, as I do.
Why do you think the church has paid so little attention, and academics as well as the church, so little attention to these figures who helped along the way?
Yeah, so I don't think this was like a conspiracy. It wasn't a bunch of monks in like hooded capes round a round circle, I think it was partly because the way the Romans thought about slavery, they thought that enslaved people, especially literate workers, secretaries, readers, that they were just extensions of the enslaver. What I mean by that, and we sort of have this in English, is they would refer to their secretary as their hand. They only recognized them as people who did things when they made mistakes. Then all of a sudden, you see the secretary or the copyist. We sort of do that. If any of you have heard this idea, this kind of quasi-scholarly idea that copyists corrupted scripture, that's kind of a version of that. What we don't see when we hear that is that copyists were trying to preserve scripture. They were often copying texts that had been nearly destroyed. They're curators. It's not just this negative thing. So one reason we don't see them is that the logic of slavery erases enslaved people. And I think one reason we as scholars don't see them is we've sort of inherited that. And also, I'm going to tell you, it is tough for writers, which scholars are, to accept that we too owe debts to other people, to our copy editors, our editors, to the people who work in the factories who make our books, to the librarians who, arrange the books in the library, to our students, to our colleagues, sometimes to our children or our partners. And we often like to think we're the one. But actually, I think there's sort of a broader message about how we all need to acknowledge the debts that we have to other people, which, it's a very 1 Corinthians view. We're all part of one body that works together. But it's also just a practical truth that we all rely on others.
We can't do it alone. We're collaborators in a community, not individuals.
Right. I'm not an individual authorial genius. This book is, lots of people help me with it. The mistakes are mine. But if there are good things about it, those belong to other people too.
In your research, what conclusions did you expect to find and then find, and what surprised you along the way?
I think, what did I expect to find? I expected to once I realized it was sort of like a light bulb going on, I was like, oh yeah. It took me a while to realize how influential a reader, early Christians, they gathered, someone read the text aloud to them. And their tone of voice, their hand gestures, you see I gesticulate, but in antiquity, hand movements are really important. And for people who had hearing loss, you could follow the hand gestures and the kind of the feeling with, even if you couldn't hear every word. But when you think about tone of voice for a reader, if I'm reading the passage about the centurion at the cross, it was Easter recently, and if I say, truly this man was Son of God, that's like a sincere statement. But if I go, truly this man was Son of God, that sounds sarcastic. There's so much latitude. The entire interpretation of that passage can be altered based on how someone reads it aloud. So I didn't realize that. I think what surprised me is how once you start to think there are enslaved people involved in the production of these texts, you start to read them differently. So one story that I had read, I'd heard it in Sunday school, I'd heard it in church, I'd read it in English, I'd read it in Greek, I'd had students translate it in Greek, is the story of the healing of the paralytic. Here you have a story of 4 men bring a paralyzed man, that's all we know about them. Actually, the Greek doesn't even specify that they're men. Greek can do that. There's no room to get into the house where Jesus is, so they dismantle the roof of the house and they let him down. And I learned there are even academic translations that identify the 4 men as friends. That's what I learned too. Go Google it, you'll see Friends. It's a story about friendship. But they might be enslaved workers, because there are 2 groups of people who are carried in antiquity: rich people who just don't want to walk, and people who are not able to walk. And this person might be both. And if you think about that, and you read the rest of the story, it's suddenly a very different story. Jesus looks at the men, who aren't even identified as people. Jesus looks at them and he sees their faith, a Greek word that also means loyalty. He recognizes them. Then he turns to the man who was on the stretcher, and the Greek word for the stretcher, that in my head it's like a World War II hospital stretcher, but in early Christian artwork it's actually a pretty robust thing, a litter. And he says to him, your sins are forgiven. And then he says, take up your bed and walk. And given that wealthy people were carried, in this story, Jesus is now saying, do not hop back up on your litter and get carried around. He recognizes the work of the enslaved people who are carrying him. He recognizes their faith. And then he tells the wealthy, formerly paralyzed man to get up and carry his own litter instead of continuing to exploit these people. It's a different story. Now, you may be thinking, how could one man carry a litter? I mean, yes, but also Jesus did just heal a man of paralysis. So, this is miraculous things are happening. And so for me, what I found was when I read the New Testament, thinking about this, it read as a completely different story. Every time I hear about work being done, I'm like, well, who's doing that? And for me, that was surprising. I thought I'd just write about how writing was different. I didn't realize how much it would change how I read these stories.
One of the things I was struck by in reading your book is not just the enslaved workers who helped make the text possible, but the enslaved workers within the text. We don't often pay attention to slavery within the Bible. We might think of the Israelites being freed from slavery, escaping. We might think of Paul in a negative sense saying, slaves, obey your masters. But Jesus talks about slavery all the time. Wondering if you can talk about the role that slavery plays and why we ignore it so much.
Yeah, there is a lot of slavery, and not just explicit slavery language. There's a lot of slavery logic. I wrote 3 books on martyrdom. And it wasn't until I wrote this book that I realized that the reason why Christianity embraces that as an ethic is because dying for one's enslaver is an expectation. It's a definition of a good enslaved person in antiquity. And that made sense of how important that was in early Christianity for me, because that you have this idea, and it reverberates throughout the New Testament. Why don't we talk about it? Well, I don't know about anyone else here, but don't you feel a bit uncomfortable I know I do, right? This is not, I'd rather not, right? Wouldn't you? I don't think anyone's well served by that. But I think as Christianity grew powerful, there was this kind of bifurcation. Paul has this logic that we should think about quite carefully, this language of enslavement to Christ, which I think for affluent Christians, we're like, well, he just means like a devotion. But there are lots of people who don't hear devotion, and we need to be sensitive to that. Slavery is not just metaphorical for everyone, and it certainly wasn't in antiquity. And we, over the course of the last 2,000 years, have extracted fidelity as a concept, an idea from slavery, so that we now say things like, a translation is faithful but not slavish. Whereas in antiquity, when Jesus was speaking, those are the same thing. That to be faithful means to act like an enslaved person, to have complete devotion to the person to whom you are faithful. And when we divided those, we actually harmed people who were actually enslaved. I think we know why we don't like to talk about this, but we have to. And also, we miss so much about the story, about the message, about this collection of texts. For me, one of the really, actually, I know this sounds very dark and depressing, but one of the really meaningful things for me was realizing I struggle, I don't know about anyone else, I struggle with the language of hell and the idea of eternal punishment. Because there's got to be a point at which that turns to the unethical. Torture forever? Surely, you know? And when I realized that ideas about hell in the New Testament and early Christianity were built on the actual real practices of punishing and incarcerating low-status people in antiquity, I realized, oh, this isn't actually describing hell, it is articulating judgment using the kind of real-world apparatus that was available to people. And that was democratizing. Wealthy people never would have seen the inside of a prison in antiquity. And now these passages that I have struggled with, and if you don't struggle with them, please tell me how, because I would love that. These passages that I have struggled with and found, frankly, unethical, particularly in the ways that they have supported contemporary practices of incarceration, they read very differently. That was, for me, quite liberatory.
How do you recommend, when we see slavery in the text, how do you recommend that we as 21st century Christians read and interpret them?
Yeah, so one of the things I tried not to do in the book, because I don't know that I'm the best person to do this. I am English, and this is a country with a particular history of slavery. I'm also corpse pale, you know? I look like I was raised underground. I want to leave the more, like, in terms of how would I recommend, I'm not sure anyone should look to me, you know, and there are such talented scholars out there like Angela Parker and Mitzi Smith and Will Gaffney, who write about this, about how you deal with this. But what I would add, like my little addition to this would be, we take it seriously. Slavery isn't to everyone just kind of metaphorical dress up. You know, it's not a Britney Spears song. I realize it's a very culturally specific reference. The singer Britney Spears did a song probably in the early 2000s called I'm a Slave for You, about romantic relationships. It's not that. It's not just, you know, I feel love a lot or I'm very devoted. It has real power that we need to recognize. This isn't about making people feel bad, but it is about recognizing the ways in which erasing things is not good.
Yeah, I did notice that you made some passing references to North American and European slave trade, but you didn't talk in depth about those. I'm wondering if thinking about slavery in terms of the Bible helped you think about more contemporary practices of slavery differently.
Yeah, so I did a lot of reading. I'm not a historian of Atlantic slavery. I'm an ancient historian. I'm like, these texts aren't in Greek and Hebrew. But what I did was I read those texts, and I read them because I think I was trying to do something similar. I was trying to and understand the lived experience of enslaved people, experiences that history has not wanted to preserve quite deliberately. And to do that, I did turn to historians of Atlantic slavery, like Sadia Hartman, for example, to figure out how you do that. I have a website that I was telling you about associated with the book, so you can see how I made judgments. Sometimes I worry when I read kind of academic books written for the public. I think, well, how do you know this? You wrote this. How do you know? And I didn't want to do that. If you want to know, you can go look at the website and click, and you can check my working. But if you go look at it, you'll see there are a lot of references to Atlantic slavery, because reading those texts helped me understand dynamics and navigate telling these stories in new ways, not because they're the same, but because the work there is richer and that they're just sort of ahead of us in thinking about these issues. So I did think a lot about it. I would not in any way pretend to be a historian of more recent slavery. That would be a great insult to actual historians of Atlantic slavery. But I did want to read that work, just as I wanted to read histories of labor, and as much comparative data in order to try and produce the most accurate, or at least responsible book that I could.
When it comes to ancient slavery, you had to fill in a lot of gaps. There wasn't that historical record that you saw with transatlantic slavery. Can you talk about what that was like to kind of make really educated guesses when you didn't know what the answers are?
Yeah, well, so the first thing I say is we make educated guesses all the time in ancient history. So for example, there is a theory about the Gospel of John that, this is a dominant theory, I learned it in school in England, that it was put together from sources. The scholar who came up with this idea, the German scholar, said that the sources ended up out of order. And that's why they're out of order in the Gospel of John, because when the author of the Gospel of John was writing, a gust of wind blew the papers off his desk onto the floor, and they were out of order. Now, you can see that that's also speculative, but it's actually not even that great speculation, because with the greatest respect to Rudolf Bultmann, they don't use desks. Any of the sources would have been either bound tablets or a codex, like a book like this, or a heavy book roll, which is bound together, which means it can't be blown out of order. They don't have individual sheets the way that we did. So he made guesses, and he has to speculate. We're always speculating, but it wasn't great speculation. And so what I wanted to do was to go and check my impulses. Well, if they don't have desks, then what? And that meant a lot of research, is why it took me so much longer than my other books, but it also meant going to experts. So going to an expert in osteoarchaeology and saying, I'm looking at these skeletons, it seems to me that there's a lot of arthritis that affects people's ability to use a book roll. Am I reading this right? Because I am not this kind of biologist, And so it meant a lot of that kind of consultation, and that is collaboration, and that is probably what we should do. So I think there is guesswork. I tried to do it in an educated way, and I tried to do it in a way that was transparent. I don't want to lie to my audience. I know you've read it. There's a lot of might have, because I don't want to say something with certainty if I don't know.
I was struck by a fictional invention of yours, Felix, that kind of gave a story to some of the conclusions or hypotheses you were reaching. Can you talk a little bit about Felix?
Yeah, so I tell the story, and I'm very open. I made up this story, but I wanted to tell stories because stories are more engaging than, let me give you a range of possibilities, which are sort of very sketchy. The story I have is Felix is a reader preparing to read the Gospel of Mark at a Roman dinner party. We know they had these dinner parties all the time, and this is where many reading events happened, and for early Christians too. We have examples of this in the writings of Justin Martyr, in the Acts of Peter, and so on. And Felix is preparing, and you have to prepare because there are no gaps between the words. So you have to prepare ahead of time, and he's trying to figure out where will he leave emphasis, where is he going to like have a significant pause, things like that. And then he gets to the ending of the Gospel of Mark, and the original ending of the Gospel of Mark, any scholar will tell you, ends up with the women running away because they were afraid. But the last word in the Greek is gar, meaning because. It's, you know, you're not supposed to end a sentence with a preposition. Much less a book. And what I imagine is Felix being concerned that he is prepared, but like the book doesn't end that well. And so I imagine that Felix, who has heard other gospels being read, adds on to that a sort of more resounding conclusion that we know in the manuscript evidence as the longer ending of Mark. And it's in your Bibles. And if you have a kind of critical Bible, it'll be in square brackets, because we know it wasn't there in the first Bible. And I imagine that someone had brought a notary, sort of a shorthand writer, to take down the text, because now you have a free copy of the Gospel of Mark. Brilliant. And that person just writes it in, and that's how the longer ending of Mark came about. I have no proof that is what happened. I made it up. It's possible. It's not certain. One of the other explanations is that Mark got arrested after he finished the original conclusion and then came back and wrote the rest after he had been arrested. That person also has no proof. And their argument is actually worse because we have no proof Christians were even being arrested in this period at this date. For what? And why would he have been released? And so I imagine it. But when I was doing the research for that, and I have all the notes in the book and online for here's the evidence for a Roman dinner party. Here's the evidence that Christians were doing this. When I tell it as a narrative, I had a sentence originally that got cut. Please feel my pain about this. Felix, I said, you know, and I'm talking about the fear that a reader feels in doing this because they're held responsible. I have a footnote for that. That works. And I said, Felix was lucky that he felt fear in his stomach and not his mouth. Because obviously, if he felt it in his mouth, he might stumble over the words. And then I had this footnote that I spent, I'm not kidding, a day finding the references for people in the ancient world talking about feeling fear in their stomach and feeling fear in their throat. And when I say I spent a day, I actually emailed a world authority on ancient medicine so that she could give me the reference to Galen, famous ancient physician, talking about fear that people feel in their throats. Because I couldn't find it. I knew it was in Galen. But Galen is responsible for 1/3 of all ancient Greek literature. So I knew I wasn't going to turn that up anytime soon, you know? And so I wrote the sentence. I had my notes for this hypothetical scenario. And then my editor's like, I don't like that line. I'm going to take it out. I was like, okay. No problem. You know, knowing that I spent all of that time. And it is a fictional story. I'm very open about it. It's possible. It is by no means certain, right? But we actually don't know what happened. We're always imagining. The important thing is we know we're imagining, that we recognize that we're doing it. Because it's when we don't recognize that we're taking these gaps that we end up saying that Paul wrote Romans alone, when Paul did not write Romans alone.
The Gospel of Mark plays a specific role in the book. You use that in the example for Felix, but you also talk about Mark himself potentially being enslaved.
Yeah, this is where I started. So I love Mark. Mark is my favorite. I know we're not supposed to play favorites, and I know that like for a solid 30% of you, your favorite is John, and there's another 30% whose favorite is Luke. I know that. Bear with me. I love Mark. And what I realized was, so Mark, according to the earliest layer of tradition, Papias of Hierapolis in the 2nd century, Mark took down Peter's words. He was his interpreter. And Papias says, well, he wrote down everything he could remember that Peter had said to him. And he's a linguistic interpreter. You can imagine Peter would need that. Peter's a fisherman. He knows some Greek. But, you know, His Greek's not amazing. The message is complicated. He needs someone to explain and expound on what he's saying. You know, it's probably hard enough for you to communicate what you're saying, and everyone speaks the same language. And that language of interpreter makes it sound, that job is done by enslaved people in antiquity. Go look at all the papyri, that's who's doing it. And it seems to me that Papias is presenting Mark as a kind of enslaved worker. And that story might be apocryphal, it's 2nd century. But I think what I find significant about it is it expresses a relationship that's true. And I love Mark, which is why it's in the book so much. But when you look at the Gospel of Mark, you can see there are little gaps in the story that speak to the experiences of enslaved people. This is a gospel written around 70, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the mass enslavement of Jewish people who were then forcibly emigrated different places. There's a lot of trauma and grief. People lost their families and experienced horrible things, and then you have this gospel that does not shy away from pain. The crucifixion in Mark is brutal, will not let you look away. It's not like the death of Achilles or Socrates who makes a joke. You feel it. And that was a pain that people didn't often get to see recognized in literature. It was a way to connect with this story, to articulate their own pain. We know that during the First Jewish War, that anyone who tried to flee Jerusalem was crucified outside the city in view of the inhabitants. You can imagine how powerful this story about a man from the Galilee being crucified would have been to those people. And I could give you like a dozen other examples from the Gospel of Mark that speak to those experiences. But for me, it helps me understand the power of this story. And I know you all want to inject into your crucifixion story, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, or Tetelestai, it is finished, from the Gospel of John. It's a better story when it's all put together. But there's a real power to sitting with that and to thinking about what that meant to people in the ancient world, because it's important to think about, who are we reading with when we read these texts? Are we just reading with bishops and emperors? Or are we reading with the people who wrote these texts and for whom they were written?
So we have some time for your questions for Professor Moss. Natalie Johnson is here in the room. You can raise your hand and she'll come around with a question card and bring those questions up to me. If you're joining us online, you can email me your questions at pthompson@stbarts.org. You can also type them into the live chat on YouTube or the comments on Facebook, and email works if you're here in the room too. While we're waiting for those questions, again and again, you emphasize the importance that this is not one text by one author. And in fact, really, this quest to find the pure text of any of these books is not possible. We're never going to get, or it will be very difficult for us to get to a pure text. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so certainly, like, you were in seminary. I also went to a seminary. Although I did like probably a more academic, focused degree. And when I was there, I was told, we're looking for the single author, what they meant, and the earliest text. And I feel the rhetorical pull of that too. Someone tell me what it means. And multiple authors complicate our ability to think about, what does the text mean? But actually, I think that's really, for me, that's a place of refuge. These are hard texts. Paul never says that slavery is bad. He never says we should get rid of it. Everyone's pretty okay with patriarchy. There's a lot there, right? Knowing that there is a fluidity in how people were interpreting and working with these texts. That, to me, makes me think, well, people have always been able to resist certain messages. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians about how you should not visit sex workers, and a man who had done this should be thrown out of the community. You're probably familiar with that. And sorry, this was such a rookie mistake. I might just hold this. Can you hear this? And I should have known better. I'm supposed to do TV news a lot. And he says, that man should be thrown out of the community. And then you have this story, first in the Gospel of Mark and then in Luke, where it's very clear there's a woman with a jar of nard who comes to Jesus in Mark 14 and Luke 7. She anoints Jesus. In Luke, she cries and washes his feet and dries his feet with her hair. She's identified as a sinful woman. She's clearly a sex worker. And Jesus never tells her to leave her profession. That woman is part of the community. Paul had created a situation where enslaved people who did not have sexual autonomy could not be full members of the community because they don't get to decide. And then there's a story that shows up in the Gospels that resists that conclusion. I think that's beautiful. I think we see, a kind of resistance to certain strategies of power. I'm not saying Paul deliberately was being mean to enslaved people. I'm saying we can see a kind of advocacy for the marginalized, which is consonant with what anyone would say is the message of Jesus. None of you are shocked to learn that Jesus is okay with sex workers. You've heard that since you were children, if you've been going to church since you were children. But I think seeing that kind of resistance and pushback is, to my mind, emboldening for people who live today.
We have a lot of really good questions, but luckily some of them are the same. I'll try to get through as many as I can.
Can we skip the hard ones?
A few people are surprised to hear about enslaved people being literate. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Such a good question that I obviously should have addressed. The reason we're surprised is because we know that in more recent iterations of slavery, that people who were enslaving others deliberately tried to keep them illiterate, because everyone knows literacy is power. Now, here's why they were able to do that. They had glasses, they had better nighttime lighting, and they had printing presses. In antiquity, they couldn't do that because all writing must be done by hand. All administrative labor, all bureaucratic labor is written by hand. I don't know if any of you took long exams in school when you were children, but if you did, and you're writing really fast, about 45 minutes in, you start doing this. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Now imagine that's day in, day out. It's painful, it hurts. You will get carpal tunnel. By the 17th century, people call it Scrivener's palsy. They say you can get full body paralysis from Scrivener's palsy. You probably can't, but you can get very, very painful arms, and no one wants to do it. So Romans educate enslaved workers to do all the literate work that they cannot do because of vision loss or because of problems with their hands. A lot of people have arthritis, or they just don't want to do because it's hard. Writing a letter, a love letter particularly, yeah, okay, we all want to write our own love letters. But copying a gospel is hard. I could not do it. When you look at the beautifully copied gospels, I physically do not have the skills to copy even a page like that. And I won a handwriting competition. When I was young, I won a competition for beautiful handwriting, and now I couldn't do it at all. Romans don't want to do this work, because it's hard. And so this is why they educate enslaved workers. If they'd had electricity, if they'd had a printing press, if they'd had glasses, they would have felt differently.
Can you talk a little more about the differences between slavery in ancient Rome and say, the transatlantic slave trade? How did slavery, what were the key similarities and differences?
So key similarities and differences. So Roman slavery, people were enslaved in a variety of ways. One was war. War was the primary driver of Roman slavery. So for example, Julius Caesar conquers Gaul, which we know as France, 1 million enslaved people from that one conquest. Similar conquest throughout the Roman Empire. So at the height of the empire with military expansion, that's where most of their enslaved workers come from. And Roman slavery, it's complicated. but it is not grounded in the same racial or pseudoscientific theories of race that emerge in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So that while there is an understanding that certain groups of people are particularly, quote unquote, slavish in antiquity, there's no understanding that this racial group is sort of innately slavish. And sometimes there would be, so for example, when all of the Gauls were conquered, people began to think of enslaved people as having curly red hair, because that's what the Gallic slaves looked like. So that is a key difference. They also, enslaved workers also come into the pool through debt slavery, very, very rare, but you get some of it in the New Testament, so you may know about it. Piracy, kidnapping. And this is a horrible phrase, but there's no other way to put it, and sometimes we have to look at violence directly. Breeding programs. Other differences, well, you're more likely to be manumitted in Roman slavery. And once you've been manumitted, you're never going to end up a senator. You're never going to be emperor. You're not going to be super, super, super important. But you can garner a lot of wealth. A big difference is that because of Atlantic slavery, the theories of race that emerge, and the way that those continue to oppress and subjugate people even after emancipation, Atlantic slavery has a much more brutal legacy than Roman slavery. What I want to shy away from, because sometimes people do this, because people like the Romans. Look at Washington, D.C. You really like the architecture of the eagles. People like the Romans, and so what they try to say is that Roman slavery is not that bad. It's not a competition. And there's no situation in which you're enslaved and might be beaten to death for something that isn't even your fault that is not that bad. This is not an internship at a hedge fund, as I have seen people compare it to. And we should continue to recognize that.
Can you address the letter to Philemon?
The letter to Philemon. So this is a letter where we all know Onesimus is an enslaved person. Sometimes we use the phrase runaway, which is a little problematic because, if someone kidnapped you, we wouldn't so much say that you ran away as we would say that you escaped. So we should probably say that. There's a lot of debate about what's happening there. Paul is advocating for Onesimus. Onesimus may have carried the letter, may have written the letter. He may be an enslaved literate worker. Paul is advocating for generosity. It's clear that something has happened here. There's a popular narrative that Onesimus previously wasn't a Christian and now is a Christian, and that's why Paul is doing this. I think we can recognize the ways in which the letter to Philemon is Paul advocating for Onesimus, because Onesimus could have been executed if he truly, quote unquote, ran away. And Paul is saying that he should be treated as a brother, and he may in fact have been a biological sibling because of the ways that enslavers in antiquity treated their female enslaved workers. But he doesn't say that slavery is wrong. And we still have to sit with that. And I know that's painful for us. It's not as painful for me as it is for other people.
Jesus tells some parables, and there are groups of workers, and that's sometimes translated servants, sometimes translated slaves. How do you make sense of those parables and those words, and what does it mean that Jesus is looking to slavery or servanthood as a symbol?
It's not great. This should trouble us, that Jesus's go-to is always, let's see some enslaved people beaten up, and that's like the prelude to the message, which is don't kill the son of the vineyard owner. That's not great. That should trouble us. These are, the genre of the parable is they're basically fables, and fables were often told by enslaved people, and they weren't supposed to be about overthrowing the regime. They were about survival. And so when you look at them in that way, you can sort of cut Jesus some slack. I would say we have an obligation when it comes to the translation. We need to consistently translate that language. So, and we shouldn't avoid that language just because it makes us uncomfortable. The place where we usually avoid it is Mary, the mother of Jesus. I'm sure some of you are bristling already. That is what she says. She uses that language. And when we pretend that enslaved people are just servants, we make it sound like they're volunteering. They're not volunteering. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why are we so uncomfortable with the idea that Mary was enslaved? Because to my mind, if we're thinking about like high Christology, how do we put a human being and a God in one person without violating cosmic laws? That's not harder for an enslaved person than for any other kind of human being, theologically speaking. The only reason we would think that it is if we think that there truly is something inferior about being enslaved. And hopefully that's not a thing any of us would say. So even if we feel resistant, we have to ask ourselves why. And I think to the work of Clarice Martin on these translational issues, I think it's important.
So we've dealt with a lot of sobering stuff in our own text. Mm-hmm. Can we end on a positive note? You talked about the interpretation being something hopeful. What else is hopeful for you in this study?
Thank you. I apologize. You were just like having a Sunday. You were going to go listen to the new Taylor Swift album. And here, it's also quite sobering. But I think this is hopeful. I think that there are so many things that for me as a scholar, thinking with enslaved workers can help me understand. I give a lot of examples of those in the conclusion of my book. But for me, it's not about fixing problems that I had when I was reading the text, what I didn't understand. For me, it's more about the flexibility that it gives me. This is a hard set of texts, realizing that people have always been resisting, that it is a fluid composition, that it is a text that has the meaning of which has always been generated by a community, a collaboration. That to me is liberating and empowering, because there are things here that will give anyone pause, because these are ancient texts. And I think fundamentally that thinking about enslaved workers and their role in the creation of Christianity, in the spread of the Christian mission, these are all missionaries we're talking about. I think, for me personally, thinking about them gives us a call to think about our own lives, about who we see and who we don't see. And I think that's, that might be challenging, but it's also positive. I hope you can all disagree.
Professor Candida Moss, thank you so much.
Thank
we
you.
really appreciate it. And a quick reminder, if you're here in person, that God's Ghostwriters, as well as Divine Bodies, are available in our bookstore, and you can pick them up. You might be able to even catch Professor Moss on your way out for a signature. And we hope that you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m., whether in person or online, and also come back next week. It'll be the Sunday of our annual Bishop's Visitation, and our Bishop Suffragan, Alan Shin, will be with us. See you then.